We are just 1 week away from Oklahoma football on the field in fall camp in Norman. Welcome into Sooners Live right here, the voice of college football. Appreciate you stopping by. We will take your comments and questions in the chat. We appreciate your super chat contributions as well. Jason Ray's here, and we're going to talk some OU football. Jason, what's going on today?
Well, happy Friday, Mark. It's good. Afternoon grind is the weekly grind is about over, so I'm happy to talk some football.
There we go. I'm with you. And we're going to talk some offensive football, which has been a good place for Oklahoma fans to talk over the last 20 years or so. Of course, the Bob Stoops and Lincoln Riley eras have brought as much offense to any one program than anybody in college football. But this is a different era, different type of football team. But Jason and I are going to run through the OU offense today. So again, comments and questions are welcome, folks. So Dillon Gabriel is, of course, off to Oregon. And I made a post just a few days ago because it's rather astounding that if he turns in the same season this year that he did last year, he will set the all-time touchdown and yardage records in college football. He will be the all-time leader in career yardage and touchdowns.
Wow, that's crazy to think about. But yeah, I'm trying to remember. So this will be his. So he was at UCF for 3 years,
Yeah.
correct? Then at Oklahoma for 2, and Oregon for here. I mean, I know that 1 year in UC that his 3rd year at UCF before transferring to Oklahoma, his season was cut after about 3 or 4 games, right? But yeah, there's not really. I think it's interesting. We've thought about this. Or I've talked about this in other sports, particularly like softball, but from a football perspective as well, we're getting towards the end of the whole COVID extra year type of thing. So I think Gabriel had the issue with he did have the extra COVID year plus that redshirt year as well. So yeah, 6 years in college now.
Yeah, so he certainly will not be setting the record in regards to average yards or touchdowns per game, but
Right.
the COVID exemption certainly has set up Dillon Gabriel to be the all-time leader um, in college football, having played at 3 schools. Okay, what is left is Jackson Arnold, obviously, who we got to see in the Alamo Bowl against Arizona. We saw a lot of good. We saw a few mistakes with 3 interceptions in a turnover-plagued game and 361 yards passing, but all eyes are on Jackson Arnold.
They are, Mark, and I think it's a little bit interesting. I mean, to bring up Gabriel because I don't know that it was necessarily a situation where Gabriel was pushed out the door, but I think the writing on the wall was that I think there was a lot of interest within those walls to have the Jackson Arnold era begin for Oklahoma. So be that as it may, you're right. Jackson Arnold's first, not completely atypical for a true freshman, especially in a bowl situation where you've got so many different not really holdouts, but people that aren't playing to get ready for the draft and things like that. So it was a little bit of a makeshift offensive line, makeshift team to be fair. But yeah, there was a lot of good. I think there was, he threw for over 300 yards, a couple of touchdown passes, but there was a couple of, as you mentioned, a couple of interceptions, 3 interceptions to be exact. Couple of fumbles. Oklahoma was not clean with the ball in that game. 6 turnovers overall in the game, and still almost won the game. Right, lost by single digits to Arizona in that game. But yeah, I think it's interesting. The offense, I think, between the quarterback play and between the offensive line, I think that's going to be the key. The key thought, and we'll get into this a little bit more. But I think the skill position players, I think, are good. I think I would say that they're SEC level good enough. Like they're good enough to compete at that level. It's just going to be kind of the quarterback play and the offensive line. So, I mean, I would assume once you go in and honestly, spring wasn't good. I mean, and I think from the perspective of the offensive line was even more makeshift than probably what it will be going into fall camp. There was a lot of those kids that they held out due to injuries, and so he went through, kind of a lot of situations where he just didn't have enough time, whether it was in the spring game or whether it was in some of their scrimmages that they had in the spring, just really didn't have enough time. And, part of a young kid is really kind of learning to read defense, understand coverage, things like that. And he really just wasn't afforded the time. So I don't know that I would go so far as to say it was really kind of a wasted spring for him, but I think that's part of it. And that's one of the things that offensive coordinator Seth Latrell had mentioned in a luncheon that they had, with all the coaches, that a big area for him this year, and particularly this summer, is his ability to learn defenses, learn coverages, and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's for, for a kid that's will be making his second career start when Oklahoma kicks off against Temple on August 31st. It's August 30th, I guess I should say. It's going to be one of those things where he'll get it. It's good to have Temple. It's good to have, some of those games that they have in front of them, before Tennessee, to get his feet wet, so to speak, a little bit. But the measurables are there. Like when you look at true measurables in terms of arm strength, what he's able to do with his feet, he's probably got that level, maybe a little bit better than Gabriel, right? Just from a measurable perspective. But I think what's going to be interesting to see how that kind of manifests through the season is, his ability to read coverages, his ability to understand where the blitzes are coming from, and things like that too, as they get into the season.
So it sounds like Oklahoma's decision to somewhat nudge Dylan Gabriel out the door in favor of Jackson Arnold was twofold. One would be that, to your last point, if Jackson Arnold fulfills his potential, he has a higher ceiling than Dylan Gabriel. And coaches are typically enamored with, for as much as they are conservative by nature, on one hand, to think, okay, we don't want mistakes. We want to limit mistakes because more games are lost than are won. On the other hand, uh, coaches are typically have enough confidence or ego in them to think, um, I can take the best player, the most talented player, the one with a higher ceiling, and I can coach the mistakes out of them, and I can coach them, and they can reach their potential under me. And then obviously there's the experience factor or the eligibility factor of having Jackson Arnold for multiple seasons versus this would have been a last go for Dylan Gabriel. So
Yeah,
makes sense in both ways.
yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I mean, the writing was on the wall when Levy left, right, for the coaching job. And I think, and it wasn't completely because Levy was the offensive coordinator here, but he was a big factor in getting Dylan over here. So I think just from a fan base perspective, Mark, it's interesting. I think there was a lot of, so not this past year, but the year before, there was a lot of key turnovers and key moments in games where, Oklahoma lost a lot of those one possession, 3 point, 7 point games. And so I think there was a lot of, and again, for Oklahoma fans alike and people that cover Oklahoma and watch Oklahoma football, we've even talked about this. Any quarterback is going to be compared, fair or otherwise, or is going to be compared to Jalen Hurts, Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray. And I think after that first year, he was probably in most people's minds well below that expectation. But I think then you look at last year, and I think particularly it happened in Texas. He probably had his best game as an Oklahoma Sooner against Texas in that game. Played mistake-free football, did not turn the ball over. Was really good with his legs, made really good decisions, made a lot of clutch throws late in that game for Oklahoma to win that game. And then I think the change, I think, happened in a lot of people. Okay, this is a guy that has clearly improved from year one to year two, but I think also he's a guy that Oklahoma probably wanted to keep, and things like that. But it's a balancing act, I think, right? When you have these ballyhooed freshmen that come in, and with the transfer portal and just kind of the mentality, I think, of some of these kids nowadays that aren't willing to wait more than a year to get their spot. I think the probably behind closed doors, the conversation was, okay, I know we want Dylan to come back to be a part of this team, but at the same time, what does that do to Jackson Arnold? Does he potentially want to look elsewhere? So I think it was one of those, like I said, I don't know that they necessarily pushed him out the door, but I think it was one of those things with where Dylan was kind of considering what he was going to do, and then Jeff Levy had decided to move on, and felt like that he was ready to move on as well. So then obviously then the Jackson Arnold era started last year in the Alamo Bowl.
And Jason, even though nobody wants to see Jackson Arnold on the sideline during any kind of meaningful snaps, they would love to see the backup quarterbacks because Oklahoma's up by 4 touchdowns. But Casey Thompson is not a bad backup. You get a guy that's led the Big 12 in touchdown passes. He's been at a couple major stops, and there's some insurance there that if they need to make it from week 5 to week 8 because there's a minor injury to Jackson Arnold or something like that, that he can keep them above water.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think that was a key get in the portal for Oklahoma from a backup perspective, because obviously with Dylan being gone and Jackson as the full-time starter, and Oklahoma had a couple of defections in that quarterback room from a portal perspective as well, was very key for him. And you're right, he's a guy that's dependable. Played really, really well in this game against Oklahoma a few years ago. Um, 52 touchdown passes for his career. So a guy that's, to your point, Mark, has been through it, has been through the ringer. Didn't have a great year last year at Florida Atlantic. Got injured early on in the year and was done for the remainder of the year. But yeah, I think he's a guy that you can have come in. Now I say that, but I say Michael Hawkins, true freshman, coming in as well, was in the spring, and heard this from Gabe Eichert that covers Oklahoma. He said the most impressive true freshman that he's ever watched. And he caveated that comment to a degree, like, okay, I'm not saying that he's going to come in and be your day one starter, but I think he's probably a little bit more ready than most people would think. So I think that'll be a really interesting battle, Mark, and fall camp between those two, because I mean, I think you got Casey Thompson, as we've talked about, he's a fifth year senior. He's been through it. He knows what big time college football is all about, playing at Texas for a few years, being at Nebraska. Um, but um, but Michael Hawkins, like I said, comes from a good family, turned a lot of heads. Um, you know, may not necessarily have been the most ballyhooed recruit, as you mentioned. He was only a 3-star guy here, um, from a 247 perspective, but certainly a guy that will be that will be able to, I think, challenge for that backup role, and it'll be an interesting battle in fall camp.
Jason Ray breaking down Oklahoma football for us, and we are looking at the offense this week. Of course, the Sooners go to fall camp after completing SEC Media Days last week, and its fall camp starting on July 31st. You touched on the offensive line, which is interesting from the standpoint that nobody's back, but they're not completely inexperienced because they bring in all these transfers that total 114 starts. And of course, much like the quarterback position, even though this is the question mark on the team, it's also a place where Oklahoma's been extremely strong in the past with the Joe Moore Award here in the last 5 years. And if there's a pillar there, it's of course Bill Bedenbaugh running the show.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think the constant of having Bill Bedenbaugh there helps, and we talked about that this last week as well. They felt like maybe the the mesh between Bedenbaugh and Latrell will be a little bit better than Bedenbaugh and Levy, because there was uh, there was some word that came out that not that they were at odds or anything, but they just didn't really necessarily completely see eye to eye on game plan and execution and things like that. Whereas, I think obviously the hope is from an Oklahoma fan perspective, but just the hope just in general is, that's a little bit better this year moving forward. But yeah, you're right. Oklahoma comes in really only having one starter, and that's Jacob Sexton returning, and he was a partial start. He didn't start all year, but they bring in, you know, 5 different transfers on the offensive line. Fabechi Wau. I'm probably butchering that name. So he's a transfer from North Texas. He's probably the best of the group. I can't imagine that he wouldn't be one of your starters. 6'4", 340, probably will play anywhere in that 330 to 340 range. From North Texas, Branson Hickman, who is the guy that came in a little bit later in the spring. He's transferred from SMU, multiple year starter at SMU. So he's a guy that you probably think will transition to that center role pretty quickly, pretty easily. Gabriel Hatchett, who is a transfer from Washington, played about, I think, he played in 8 or 9 games, started 4 or 5 this past year for Washington. He'll be a guy that I think Oklahoma will have in the mix from a guard perspective. Michael Tarkin, USC transfer, 6'6", 317's got the measurables. He's probably a tackle, right? I mean, I think he'll be in the mix from a right tackle perspective. And as I mentioned, Jacob Sexton. I think right there, those are probably your guys that you think are most likely going to be slotted in as starters. Troy Everett, who was the center last year, towards the in part of the year, had a pretty bad injury early on in camp. Looks like he's early on in spring camp. Looks like he's a little bit further along than most people thought. He's not probably won't be ready for camp or maybe even the first game or two. But early on in the season, he should be able to provide some depth for Oklahoma. And then you've got a few other ones. Jake Taylor, he's one of the tackles as well. He's made from everything that I understand, he's made a pretty big jump in the summer. Spencer Brown was the other transfer. Was from Michigan State. He's a guy that played a little bit in the spring with, I think, Mark, a little bit of mixed reviews. Maybe not quite, at least maybe, and could have been just kind of getting acclimated to Oklahoma and getting acclimated to the program and everything, but maybe not quite as good, like right on as they thought. So I know that Venables talked a little bit about this, that felt like they could be 8 or 9 deep on the offensive line and really not lose a ton. But I think that's gonna, with the new pieces, you can make an argument that a few of those are going to be upgrades over what Oklahoma had this past year. But I think at the same time, it'll be interesting to see how all of those new faces mix, especially when you're looking at probably 4 of the 5 starters being transfers from 4 different teams.
Talking up the Sooners here at the Voice for College Football. We appreciate you stopping by. Also, keep in mind that we've got SEC channels all over the place, including, Texas and all sorts of SEC channels. And please subscribe to our SEC channel. So we got the particular team channels, but we also have the SEC channel, and we're shooting for 1,000 subs before we hit opening kickoff. So that link is in the description section of all the videos, including this one. And so you can grab it right there at the top of the description section. Tyree Walker was leaned on quite a bit, maybe more than some people anticipated because of various situations and injuries and so forth. But he's off to Wisconsin. When I look at Javante Barnes and Gavin Sawchuk's name, Jason, I'm remembering going back to their recruitment. Of course, they came in together. People were excited about them being the combo of the future. And ever since, at least in my eyes, it has swung back and forth in regards to who's had the advantage. Now I'm getting them mixed up in terms of who ran for 100 yards a couple times that first season and ran for 100 yards against Florida State in the bowl game, and then seemed like, then he got nicked up the next year, and they kind of went back and forth in regards to who was going to be the guy to break through first.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Mark. And I think so when you look at Gavin Sawchuk was the guy that played in the bowl
Okay.
game, to your point, that really didn't play a whole lot at all during the season 2 years ago, but got that opportunity in the bowl game because of some other holdouts that were happening. And yeah, and to your point, performed really well. And unfortunately for him, to start the season, he had a little bit of a nagging injury that caused him to not be anywhere near 100%. But he had 5 straight 100-yard performances to end the season, including a 100-yard performance against Arizona. So like he had 744 yards, but kind of looking from a statistical perspective, 617 of his 744 came in the last 5 games of the year. 8 of his 9 touchdowns came in that span as well. So he's a guy that I think he's a good. I mean, I think you could probably 1,200, 1,400 yard type of kid if he is able to stay healthy throughout the year. So he looks to be healthy early on. I mean, from a spring practice perspective. So I think going into fall camp, he's probably your clear cut number one going into that now. And I think the other ones, as you'd mentioned, with Tawi Walker transferring and going to Wisconsin, I think you've probably got a logjam for the next few backs. You mentioned Javante Barnes, I should say. He's a guy, Mark, that I think has not is not incredibly lived up to those expectations. I think he unfortunately got himself into the doghouse a little bit with Jeff Lebby, and he really just didn't he didn't completely get out of the so he didn't really have a lot of opportunities. He went, back and forth, a little bit earlier in the year, and then, just as you can see here on the screen, just didn't get a lot of opportunities for whatever reason. He was a guy that actually was going to hit the portal this off season, but they were able to talk him into staying. So, we'll be interested to see with sort of a new regime there, if what that looks like, if he's able to, kind of bust through and be part of that group. And I think a couple other names to keep your eye on is Caleb Hicks. He's a guy that played a little bit, not very, very sparingly last year, but did really, really well in the spring. Last year in the spring, did really, really well this spring as well. But I think probably the guy that has the biggest upside of them all is true freshman Taylor Tatum, number one running back recruit by most in the country. 5-star guy, top 50, 75 kid overall in the country. So, and all returns seem to be him being, kind of living up to what they thought he was, at least from a summer perspective. So we'll see what happens in camp, and obviously, when the uh, when the pads come on, it's a little bit different, right? But he seems to be a guy that has an enormous ceiling. So I think very much like the conversation that we had with Jackson Arnold, I think he's probably, along with Gavin Sawchuk, probably the most talented kids on the roster. And so if he does the things that DeMarco Murray is wanting him to do, in terms of how he picks up blitzers, how he does in the receiving game, and just his ability to block and things like that, I think will go a long way. But DeMarco Murray's not really one of those that's very quick to hand out compliments. But he's gushed over this kid a few times, so it'll be interesting to watch in fall and early on in the season, what kind of how many carries that he's able to get, and how good he's able to be as a true freshman, and crack that, either not necessarily starting lineup, but be part of the regular rotation.
So if Tatum's as good as advertised, and he probably is long term, but maybe not necessarily as a freshman, but let's say he is able to pick up some of the nuances of the game, pass protect, so he's not a liability, and do some of those things. Do you think Sawchuk is a 15 to 20 carry guy, and they get Tatum and Barnes 5 or 6 or 7 each? Is that the
I
best
wouldn't.
formula?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see how that probably starts that way. During the season, Mark. I think I do think that Oklahoma will run the football a little bit more with Seth Latrell, a little bit more power, as opposed to a little bit more of a finesse style with Jeff Levy. But yeah, I think that's fair to start the season, and then we'll see how that goes from there. If Tatum's one of those kids that he's just too good to keep off the field and limit to those amount of carries, then yeah, absolutely, it could end up being more of a kind of a 50-50 thing. And I think with Sawchuk's injury this past year, it's obviously good to have multiple guys that they feel comfortable with going into the SEC. But yeah, I think he's a guy that I'm super excited for to see. Myself, multi-sport athletes, going to play baseball as well at Oklahoma. So will be very intriguing because maybe the depth isn't quite. I mean, it's there. It's just kind of unproven depth, if that makes sense.
Folks, we talk Oklahoma football with all of you each and every week, Jason and myself. So here's the deal. We don't always know when we're going to be able to get together, but all you need to do is subscribe to the channel and hit that bell for the notifications, and we will notify you on when we are going live. So, for example, we sent that out yesterday in regards to a notification, so you will always know when we're going to go live in advance. So please lock it in here at the Voice of College Football and don't miss a show. All right. Deion Burks comes in from Purdue. People are excited about him. I know that Nick Anderson, it seemed like every time he got his hands on the ball last year, was making big plays, and it seemed like he should have probably caught a few more. And Jalil Farouk had a nice season, and he's back.
Yeah, Mark, I think probably if you were to look at it from a holistic perspective on the offense, the wide receiver room is probably the strength of the offense, I would say at this point, as a total group. As you mentioned, Deion Burks coming in for Purdue is going to be one of those guys that stretches the field a little bit more, but I think more so, even more so than that, he's the guy that's probably going to take Drake Stoops' place in terms of being that slot receiver. Sometimes, obviously, Drake Stoops is not a stretch the defense guy, but he was a guy that would make the tough catches over the middle, in that slot position as well. So he'll be asked to be that guy. I think, obviously, athletically, and probably a little bit of a improvement over what Drake was, but the production. I mean, Drake caught over 80 balls last year, almost 1,000 yards, best season that he's had in Norman. So those are high. Those are big shoes to fill. But when you look down the line, Mark, whether you talk about Nick Anderson or Jaden Gibson, Andrell Anthony, Brendan Thompson, Jalil Farouk, Jaquays Padaway, they've got a lot of guys that will have the opportunity um, to compete. I think the one thing just to kind of keep in the back of your mind, Andrell Anthony had that ACL injury early in the year. He's going to be a guy that's probably not quite ready game one, but early on in the season, he'll be ready. Jalil Farouk, kind of the same situation. He had a little bit of a injury in spring that's going to keep him out the first part of the year. So you're just going to look for some of these other guys to make sure that they're able to step up. I would anticipate those guys, at least Andrew Anthony, Jalil Farouk, they'll probably be back by Tennessee at the latest. But yeah, to your point, Nick Anderson only 38 catches, but 10 of those 38 catches went for touchdowns, and almost 800 yards on those 38 catches. So this is a team that has the ability to they have the ability to stretch the field. You've got possession guys there as well. So this should be an area of strength for this team. Even early on, I think it'll give an opportunity for some of these kids like Jaden Gibson and Brendan Thompson and Jaquays Petaway to maybe step up a little bit and prove that they have the ability and they can go 7 or 8 deep on the receiving side of things. Jaden Gibson was a guy that Joe John Finley called out in their luncheon a couple of days ago was as a guy that not a lot of people that are talking about, but has an opportunity to be a big time contributor to this team. So yeah, I think it'll be exciting to look at and see how they perform. Had a couple of injuries within that group last year, and it will be exciting to see when they're healthy. What kind of production they'll be able to put together.
Our offensive breakdown, everyone. We will hit the defense next week. We appreciate you being here on the Voice of College Football. And so, best case scenario that's reasonable. What is this offense able to produce? What kind of numbers, if you want to describe it in that way, or just what kind of look is it? Terms of run pass ratio and what does this offense at its very best look like, and again in a reasonable way?
So I think when you start about talking about this, Mark, I think obviously you're going to look at the differences between what Jeff Lebby's offense was and has been, and what Seth Latrell's offense will be. I think there's a few things that you're going to see that are a little bit different. I think you're going to see. I mean, they'll go fast when they need to, but I think you're going to see a little bit more of a methodical approach with Seth Latrell versus what Jeff Lebby's offense has been go go go, quick quick quick, right? Get up to the line as quick as snap get as many snaps in as you possibly can. So I think fundamentally, I think that's the first thing. They did this in the spring. They might even huddle a little bit, which is kind of a foreign concept just in college football in general, but particularly at Oklahoma. But I think they'll have the ability to be a little bit multiple. I think there was some struggles and some things that Oklahoma had last year from an offensive perspective. Just they really didn't seem to have an identity from one week to the next. We talked a little bit about there would be a game where um, that Barnes would get a lot of carries, and then Salchuk wouldn't get as many carries, and then it would seem to kind of flip flop the next week, right? So I think there was a little bit of kind of concern with continuity and what that looks like, and some of the game plan stuff was a little bit, I think, interesting in terms of the result. Just Jeff Lebby ran what he ran versus it kind of didn't really depend. It didn't really matter what kind of defense was being played against him, or there wasn't. I think there was some concern about what game plan week to week looked like versus what Seth Latrell will be able. I mean, he's a fullback, right? So it's going to be um, I mean, fullback slash running back slash tight end, kind of what he did a little bit at Oklahoma towards the end of his career. So he's more of a smash mouth guy. So I would expect Oklahoma to maybe run a little bit more, particularly run a little bit more between the tackles than they did last year. But they're gonna be multiple as well. So I would say those are kind of the fundamental differences. Just not going quite as fast, being a little bit more ball control to kind of help the defense, being multiple, methodical, and just attacking your strengths. I think it's going to be just from a play call perspective. We saw that a little bit um, in the bowl game, right? With Latrell running things, and so I think it'll be similar, but I think you'll see some, just some small nuances that will look a little bit different. But I think really just understanding what the defense is giving you, that it'll be tailored to that, maybe a little bit more than just doing what you do, and then going from there.
So at the tight end position with Bauer Sharp coming in, we've got Jake Roberts and that crew. Do they have a tight end on the roster that you feel at this point is a guy that can really add to the receiving core, or are they just blocking guys that are functional in the passing game?
So I think Oklahoma's upgraded that position to a certain degree this season. I think there was a lot of excitement about bringing Austin Stogner back in last year, but just wasn't quite the same. He's had a couple injuries as well. Just wasn't quite that guy. And Oklahoma, quite frankly, just overall from the tight end position, just didn't get a lot of production. I think around 250 yards total from that position this past year, and only a couple of touchdowns. So obviously they went to the portal and got a couple of guys. Bauer Sharp, as you mentioned, and he's an actual converted running back from Southeast Louisiana. Jake Roberts from Baylor. They've got a true freshman, Devon Mitchell, who is an early enrollee, so he technically is still a senior. Will still be kind of a senior in high school from an age perspective coming in. But yeah, I think they've upgraded that position to a degree, but I don't think it's quite at the level that they would expect. But I think all signs kind of point to Bauer Sharp being that guy that's going to get the first. He's going to be the first guy, and so see what he'll be able to do. Not just astronomical numbers last year: 29 catches, 288 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And Jake Roberts was pretty similar at Baylor, 23 for 231. So I think it'll be a little bit of a combination of that what you'd mentioned, Mark. So not probably. I mean, not Jermaine Gresham, not Mark Andrews, clearly at that level, but maybe a little bit more than just kind of blocking an extra blocker out there. So Oklahoma will need to get a little bit more, especially in the red zone, from those guys.
Let me get your response, Jason, to Phil Steele's ranking of the offensive position units. And then just to give some context, I'll give you the top 5 in the country and some teams in the SEC that obviously Oklahoma is going to match up against. Offensive line. Georgia's number 1, Texas 2, Oregon 3, Oklahoma State 4, Florida State 5, LSU's at 6, Tennessee 8, Ole Miss is at 13, and Oklahoma at offensive line, according to Phil Steele, is number 47.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's. I mean, I don't know if they will obviously end up being that. I mean, I think it's fair to have them early on, right? I mean, I think there's a couple of different levels of thinking when you look at this. I think when you look at the offensive line, and I agree, I think this is probably a more talented offensive line than what Oklahoma has had last year. I think the transfers that they brought in, not on not all levels, right? Because you're losing a guy at left tackle, Anton Harrison, who he was a first round draft pick, right? So when you lose a guy like him, obviously you expect that to be a bit of a downgrade, and it doesn't necessarily mean the guy coming in as a bad player, but you're not always necessarily going to going to bring in number 1 draft picks in the portal, right? So I think just from when you look at it from a talent perspective, I think the talent perspective may be a little bit more, a little bit higher than number 47. However, we all know the offensive line is a group probably more than any other position group on both sides of the ball where it's critical that these 5 work as one unit. They are very cohesive together. So when you bring in and think about, obviously there's a lot of time to go and there's a lot of battles to be fought in fall camp. But if you have 4 of your 5 starting offensive linemen coming from different schools, then I think there's probably some valid concerns on how that unit is going to be able to gel together playing for the first time. So I don't think it's if you talk to anyone, I think it's the clear number on both sides of the ball. It's the clear number 1 concern is the offensive line. So to have them that low, I think if you go into the season and there is 46 other offensive lines across the country that's better than this Oklahoma offensive line, then I think you run into some concerns from a record perspective, what Oklahoma will end up having, right? But so they're obviously going to have to be a little bit better than a lot of people think. And I think the thought is that, I mean, at least at SEC Media Days, I think the thought, Mark, is that this offensive line isn't going to be that good, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons why they're picked 8th. is because, I mean, look at a team like LSU. LSU loses a ton offensively. You lose the Heisman Trophy winner, you lose a couple of first round draft picks at the wide receiver position, and they're picked fifth. One of the reasons why they'll probably have one of the best offensive lines in the SEC in the country. So I think it's very critical that this offensive line, I mean, at the very least, play as well as they did last year, but not have any dip.
Quarterback room. So this is the entire room. However, the starter, I don't know what kind of percentage he puts on this, because obviously this is kind of a different deal when you rank quarterback rooms, because if the starter doesn't get hurt, then it doesn't matter who else is there. But if the starter gets hurt, then all of a sudden the backup is everything. All right, quarterback rooms. We've got Texas at 1, Georgia 2, Oregon 3, Alabama at 4, Ole Miss 5. Then we've got Missouri at 23, Texas A&M 26, Florida 28. He's got Oklahoma at 43.
I think again, a very similar, very similar conversation, right? I mean, for a different reason. Obviously, you have to balance the talent that you expect to see out of Jackson Arnold with the lack of experience. So I think that's obviously one side of things, right? But I think with what they've got from Casey Thompson, I think that provides a little bit of a security blanket for Oklahoma as far as that goes. But I think, Mark, I don't know what you're hearing, kind of nationally on your side. I just don't think nationally there's a lot of people that have a lot of respect for what Oklahoma is going to put out there this year, right? And maybe it's mostly because of the schedule, maybe it's moving to the SEC just in general, or whatever it is. But I mean, you don't really hear anyone outside of the Oklahoma circle, right? Just really gushing about what this Oklahoma team can be. And so I don't know if it's really naivety on the Oklahoma side, because I see a lot of, even some of the local media in terms of picking. They mention um, what their order of finishes is, and a lot of the Oklahoma media feels like Oklahoma is probably in that 4 to 6 range versus the SEC, and kind of nationally a lot of people got Oklahoma in that 7 to 8 range. So um, I think it's more I heard this mentioned this week. I think it's one of the more, for me as well. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. One of the more exciting seasons in quite some time, just because everything that's new for Oklahoma, and navigating. And I heard this this said just brilliantly, that feels like, to a certain degree, Oklahoma is fighting against, maybe not necessarily against, but they're fighting for historically what Oklahoma means. Because I don't think there's a ton of respect coming in, um, for what that has meant historically. So um, it'll be, like I said, it's one of the most intriguing seasons I can remember, just to see after Oklahoma gets some games in. Okay, Oklahoma's going to be able to adjust just fine to the SEC. May not be a contender year one, but they'll get there. Or is it one of those? Or is it one of those situations where, oh gosh, this is a lot tougher than most people thought coming in? Oklahoma, roster wise, may not quite be ready. I tend to think it'll probably be somewhere in between, and um, so I think it's been a long time since Oklahoma's been in this situation. Oklahoma, I don't remember. I mean, outside of maybe the 90s, and what most Oklahoma people consider like the reign of terror, like between John Blake and Schnellenberger and that group is Oklahoma being picked 8th in a conference is just not something that's ever happened. So I think you see a lot of people, at least locally, are reacting very similar to the way that they reacted when Lincoln Riley went to USC. Like, it just doesn't happen. Like, OU doesn't lose, Oklahoma doesn't lose coaches unless they're going to the NFL, or unless they're, retiring or leaving. They don't leave for a different job, or what would be considered by most as a lateral at best job.
Mm-hmm.
And same here. Like, people like 8th, middle of the pack in the conference. Like, Oklahoma doesn't get picked in the middle of the pack. It's 3rd or 4th worst. So I think there's that, and I don't know that I would call it a battle, Mark, but I think it's just that conversation that's happening, both nationally and locally on, okay, what's Oklahoma going to be? What are they going to be? And what's a success? Like, I even posted this out on Twitter, or X a few days ago. Like, what's considered a disappointing season, not necessarily an unsuccessful season, but what's disappointing to you? And there's some that are out there that are saying anything less than 10-2. Now, you take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but there's some out there that are saying, if anything less than like 7-5, 8-4 is considered, um, would be considered disappointing. And I can live with that, because 6-6 is not something that you want to happen, in the SEC. But I think if you set your expectations on this team needs to have 10 wins, there's a good chance that you're going to be disappointed, because it's just a different animal. And I think there's just this thought process that it's not as big of an animal as some people will lead it to believe. So.
Yeah, you're right. Every time Oklahoma's brought up on this show or this channel, uh, or the SEC, I should say, is brought up, or the national landscape, and the SEC factoring into the playoff, it's all about Georgia, Texas, Alabama. It's about that tier first, and then Ole Miss is brought up, and LSU is brought up, and then if you delve past that, Missouri's brought up, Tennessee. I would say all those teams that I just listed, based on my observation and based on what's brought to me and what I see out there, all those schools are brought up before Oklahoma. Phil Steele, interestingly enough, regardless of what he posted about ranking those two units, and we'll get to the rest of the offensive units, if you look at his power poll, which this is strictly who he believes are the 134 teams in the country ranked without the schedule taken into consideration. Just these are the best teams. Georgia's the best team. Ohio State's the second best team. Oregon's the third best team, etc. He has Oklahoma ranked as the 7th best team in the country.
Yeah, no, I think it's
He
it's
is
very
he has them 4th in the SEC. Not now, he's not picking them 4th in the SEC, because once he applies the schedule, he believes that they have a difficult schedule that's going to drag them down to number 20.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think there's more. Yeah, I think there's more concern about when you look at Oklahoma about the schedule on top of on top of just joining the SEC just in general. But I think more so the schedule. And I think, Mark, this is just it would be interesting to see if Oklahoma and Texas's schedule was flip flopped on what the perception would be, because I see a lot. I mean, now's the season. Now's the time of the season, Mark. Right, when you're seeing people come out with their predictions, and whatever it is, whether it's just kind of conference predictions or schedule predictions or whatever that might be. But in a lot of it, you're seeing Texas in the top 3, top 4, seeing Texas in the SEC championship game, things like that. But I just wonder, is it more about the schedule, or is it more about the talent coming back? And because this is Texas is a team that's lost a lot as well, off of last year's team, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, right? But I digress. But I think it would be interesting to see, because I think there's just so much of that weight is being put on the schedule. Now, I don't know that I would necessarily, this is just my cynical side coming out, I guess, just necessarily agree that when you look at roster from top to bottom, that Oklahoma has the 7th best roster in the country. Now, I mean, I don't know. I mean, we'll see, right? I mean, I think there's the thought from recruiting and transfer portal that Oklahoma's been able, maybe outside of the quarterback position, that Oklahoma's been able to upgrade from a talent perspective in every area on this team coming into 2024 versus where they were in 2023. So, I mean, I think you can provide some credence to that, but it'll be interesting. Yeah, the schedule is just, it is what it is. Anytime, Mark, any prognostication, anything that I've seen, when you look at, when people are talking about Oklahoma, the first thing they say is schedule. They don't really talk about the talent coming back or what they've brought in, but they're saying this, but look at the schedule. So, I mean, I think that's something that's going to continue to kind of get thrown in the face of this conversation as we move forward, and it's something that you're just not going to be able to discount. Now, I think next year it'll be one of those things. It's probably not as big of a conversation, because Oklahoma's navigated through this schedule in 2024, and it's just, I mean, it's just flipped in 2025, right? So it'll be the same, except for obviously Texas will still be in Dallas, but it'll just be flipped a little bit. So, yeah, I think it's, and you made a good point. I mean, I think when you talk about schedules, it's more, I think it's more venue than it's venue, and it's some of these games that you're playing back to back, which is much tougher than they have been in the past.
Running back, Ohio State number 1, Penn State number 2, Oklahoma State number 3, Liberty 4, North Carolina 5, Georgia 9, Texas 10, Texas A&M 11, Ole Miss 13, Oklahoma 21.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that one is the one. Now the other two, I think you could make an argument that Oklahoma's a little low. I mean, but I think that one is pretty spot on, right? I mean, you've got at least one guy that you think is probably 1,000-yard rusher if he's healthy, and Gavin Sawchuk, and with Taylor Tatum coming in, and then what you have, at least from a talent perspective, from Javonte Barnes. I think that's pretty solid where that's at right there.
Wide receivers, Oregon 1, Missouri 2, Ohio State 3, Ole Miss 4, USC 5, Oklahoma 6.
Yep. I mean, I think you could, and I just kind of, I don't scoff at that, with the fact that Ohio State's 3 is a little bizarre to me. I mean, I know that they've lost a few, but they're going to have the best true freshman in the country, at wide receiver. But anyways, I think, yeah, top 10 I think is good. That's solid for Oklahoma there. I think you like I mentioned previously, I think it's the best position group on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, you can make an argument maybe the best position group on the team, but particularly on the offensive side of the ball. But if all these guys are healthy, this has a chance to be a top 5 receiving group in the country for sure.
Right, folks, that's our breakdown of the offense for Oklahoma. We will check out the defense, and of course, we will keep you informed of anything else that happens on the recruiting front or otherwise when we get back together next week. Again, please subscribe, please like the video, and make sure the notifications are turned on so you know when we go live each and every week. Jason, we appreciate you being here to break down the offense. That was fun. That was informative for me. I got to do my quick study before I jump on, so I'm prepared and I'm in that mode of trying to learn as much personnel as possible. So this is a good exercise for me.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
All right, Jason, appreciate you being here. Have a great weekend, and hopefully we can do it again next week.
All right. Sounds good.